kick things off, Lily, so I have heard your name come up multiple times in multiple podcasts, and I dove into your work. I was beyond impressed, and I realized that I have not had an episode dedicated to prenatal nutrition, nutrition during pregnancy. And this is such an important topic. Also, too, Lily, my sister is about to give birth any day now. She's expecting her first child. So kind of wish I had this episode a year ago for her, but she's done her own, due diligence on nutrition and whatnot. But just to kick things off, I always love to start by asking, how did you find yourself in this space?
Great question. It was kind of a roundabout journey to get here. I mean, I knew really early on I wanted to study nutrition. So I was one of the few people who didn't change my major in the middle of college. I was first really drawn to nutrition because I wanted to improve childhood health. It was we had this childhood obesity and diabetes epidemic. Could we reform the school lunch policy and make a dent in that? And in a roundabout way, I somehow found myself in the prenatal space. So some opportunities arose pretty early in my career to work with the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program. It's also known as Sweet Success, focuses purely on diabetes and pregnancy, as the name suggests, and then clinical work in a perinatology office in gestational diabetes. And it was, really in those roles that I learned so much about how maternal metabolism and blood sugar affects the development of the baby and then their propensity for diabetes or obesity later in their life. And it's substantial. If a mom's blood sugar is not well controlled for the majority of her pregnancy, that child's risk of developing type 2 diabetes can be anywhere from a 6 to 19-fold increased risk compared to somebody who has normal blood sugar in pregnancy. It was whoa, okay, we have a whole generation or multiple generations now of children being born with the cards stacked against them metabolically, and how unfair. It's more than just taking the sodas out of schools and providing better food and getting enough, activity for kids. Those are all important too, but it's what is their, pancreas program to handle when it comes to food? How functional are their mitochondria for burning energy? It's that those things are to some degree predetermined or pre-programmed during pregnancy. So that's really what lit me up. And then, of course, working in those spaces and being able to put the current guidelines to the test in actual clients, it was wow, these guidelines are missing the mark for blood sugar management. So, after kind of coming up with my own way of managing the condition, and of course, doing a ton of research to see whether or not doing anything different than the guidelines would even be safe in pregnancy, because first and foremost, safety is of utmost importance. You don't want to do anything that could be harmful to mom or baby. So once those boxes were checked, it was okay, we can implement this. We saw dramatic improvement. And that's ultimately what led me to write my first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And the other two have kind of come via audience request of okay, can you dive into this?
Right.
And my own experiences and my 2 pregnancies as well have really played a role in my work.
I was going to ask if you had kids. So you have 2 children.
2 kids, 5 and 9.
Those are fun ages, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely want to get into the blood sugar component, Lily, but I do want to start, I guess. I'm trying to figure out how I want to structure this because so many questions I want to ask you. But you mentioned your book, Real Food for Pregnancy. And while I know we can't cover the entire contents of that book, I would love to just maybe start by asking, what key nutrients should women be prioritizing in a prenatal diet?
Yeah, that's a surprisingly complicated question to answer because you can make the case for any nutrient, take your pick. So to start from kind of a broader top-down kind of dietary components in terms of fat, protein, and carbohydrates, you definitely want to be prioritizing protein during pregnancy. We do know that needs increase quite a bit, and the guidelines miss the mark on this one entirely. The guidelines weren't even written with any pregnancy-specific data in place. We do now have that data as of 2015. That still has not been incorporated into the guidelines, but suffice it to say, you need a lot more than what the recommendations currently are at. So more protein, and your protein needs will progress as the pregnancy progresses. When you're approaching eating protein, you don't want to take the fat out of all of your protein. You'll notice a lot of your protein-rich foods naturally contain fat, right? Eggs have the yolks, your chicken has the skin, your steak has fatty streaks in it, dairy naturally comes with fat in it unless you take it out. Nuts naturally contain fat, right? Some of the plant proteins are some of the few exceptions, like beans and legumes are fairly low in fat, generally speaking, but they still have some, right? If you start obsessively taking the fat out of everything, you screw up the nutritional content of that food. A lot of the nutrients become less bioavailable, and you also need some fat for hormone production, and there is an amped up hormone production, of course, during pregnancy. So as long as you're just eating a protein-forward diet and not obsessively taking fat out of everything, you're going to hit the marks for most things. You'll be getting enough protein, you'll be getting enough fat. Our protein-rich foods have a lot of the key micronutrients, and we can dive into that, that are required in higher amounts in pregnancy. So when it comes to avoiding anemia, for example, you need not only iron, which you'll get in the most bioavailable form in animal foods, but you also need vitamin A from animal foods. You need B12, you need riboflavin, you need folate. A lot of these nutrients are highly concentrated in your protein-rich foods. So when it comes to ticking off all those boxes, that's the simplest way of kind of explaining where to focus. Then, of course, we also want to consider the other macronutrient I didn't talk about, which is carbohydrates. And you want to focus on the highest quality, least processed carbohydrates that you can. So whole food, plant foods that haven't had all the fiber taken out of it, haven't been ultra processed from, a whole wheat berry into white flour, for example. If you're eating more of those whole carbohydrates, another example would be eating whole fruit instead of juice, where you haven't macerated it, extracted all the fiber, and then you're just left essentially with pure sugar. That's better overall for your body. So protein forward without taking out all the fat, and then whole food carbohydrates is a very good combo where you're most likely going to hit most of your micronutrient needs from food alone, and you will be pretty unlikely to face severe deficiencies.
Yeah. On the topic of protein too, Lily, obviously the market is saturated with protein powders, right? From collagen to hemp and other different plant protein sources. Do you have a favorite? And do you actually encourage women to include a protein powder in their diet? Or are you more of a let's depend upon, whole food sources for that?
So I prefer people get most of their protein from whole foods, because then you're getting the full micronutrient component. And you're also getting some of that fat that's naturally meant to come with your protein foods. I also find they're a lot more satiating. Just having a savory meal that you have to chew, you might be getting, 30 grams of protein in that meal, and your protein shake might have 30 grams of protein, but the satiety factor is often a lot different. Just notice when you have, a smoothie or protein shake. That said, I'm not anti-protein powders. I think they can be incorporated. I probably wouldn't have them replace more than maybe 1 or 2 servings of protein in a day. It depends. Sometimes we have situations where protein needs are really quite high, like in twin pregnancy, where it gets pretty difficult to meet the protein needs from food alone. It certainly can be done, but protein powders can be helpful. Or sometimes there's periods of food aversions, especially in the first trimester, where maybe meat or fish is kind of off-putting, and protein powders can fill that gap. A key factor here to look at, though, is the quality of the protein powder you're consuming. I would check with the company for a certificate of analysis on their heavy metal and contaminant testing. A lot of the plant proteins in particular tend to be high in heavy metals like arsenic or lead or cadmium. So those would be ones that you'd want to check on. I personally prefer a beef protein isolate. I do also like collagen proteins. They're technically not a complete protein. I have a whole article on my website on how it fits into your diet. It's really going to be a non-issue unless that's your only protein source. But assuming you have a serving of collagen or two, along with whatever you're eating, you're not going to run into any issues there. Those tend to be some of my favorites. And then just, again, watch for other ingredients in the protein powders. Some of them add herbs, some of which may not be safe in pregnancy. Some add a whole bunch of extra nutrients. And if you're already taking a prenatal, you may be getting too much of certain things. So I just prefer like a really simple formula, usually like a pure protein, possibly with a sweetener that's safe in pregnancy or, vanilla extract or something, but try to be careful with all the additives that can be in there.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I am curious too, Lily, what's like the equation for determining how much protein a woman needs during pregnancy? Is that a factor of weight? And obviously if she's carrying 1 or 2 children, like what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a factor of weight. So based on that newer data that I alluded to from 2015, they looked at what they call the estimated average requirement of protein, or an EAR level. That's different than an RDA. It's actually set much lower than an RDA. This study did not define the RDA, so I can't speak to that. But if we use an EAR level, we're looking at bare minimum. Okay, so I'm going to say that because a lot of people will calculate it out and they're like, oh, I actually feel better eating more. That's totally fine. This is bare minimum. It's just to say that the bare minimum that I'm recommending is still a lot more than the current recommendations.
Yeah.
So they split it up by early pregnancy and late pregnancy, which early pregnancy in this study was defined as before 20 weeks, and late pregnancy is pretty much anything beyond that. So in early pregnancy, it was 1.22 grams per kilogram of pre-pregnancy body weight. You always use pre-pregnancy body weight when calculating these. Or for late pregnancy, 1.52 grams per kilo.
Interesting. And also too, Lily, so, I mean, for the woman who's looking to get pregnant, right? At what point in time should she change her diet if her diet is probably currently not the best, in order to boost chances or improve her fertility and boost chances for conception?
So it depends. There's a number of different ways that you can look at this. First and foremost, there's no downside to having good nutrition for a longer run-up period into pregnancy.
Right.
However, we do know that the time that an egg is maturing, leading up to ovulation, is the time that it is most sensitive to nutrition changes. So at minimum, about 3 months leading up to when you're trying to conceive. Technically, if you really want to get specific, like the full time period for the recruitment of an underdeveloped follicle in your ovary to the development of a fully developed egg that's going to be ovulated in that cycle, that's 220 days, or like 7 to 8 months. So in an even more ideal world, we might give ourselves that 8 months. Now, if somebody has cycle issues or underlying health conditions that we know play a role in fertility, or maybe a risk factor for early miscarriage or adverse pregnancy outcomes, we might want to look at a longer run-up period. And nobody wants to hear that, right? But for some individuals, they'd be better off giving themselves a year or sometimes even 2 years to get their thyroid in a good place, to work on their polycystic ovarian syndrome, to optimize their low nutrient stores, to improve their blood sugar levels. Like, some people really do better off with more time. And don't leave your partner out of the equation either, because their sperm quality is also influenced by their diet and lifestyle and overall metabolic health. So it can be something that you and your partner are actually doing together.
Yeah. And does everything you say nutrition-wise hold true for men as well? Or should men be focusing on different food groups than women in terms of fertility?
So there's a lot of overlap for men and women. We have, there's a whole chapter on sperm quality and real food for fertility. There's a whole chapter on egg quality and real food for fertility. And, we go through the research on a number of different nutrients, and there is a lot of overlap. Men still benefit from a protein-forward diet. It's not great for men if their fat drops below about 40% of calories. Likewise for women, because it impairs hormone production. For men, of course, we're looking at markers like testosterone levels and their sperm quality parameters. But likewise, you see similar issues with hormone production in women when their fat drops too low. that's a consideration. Likewise, carbohydrate quality is important. The more refined carbohydrates and the more added sugars that are in the diet have similar detrimental effects on things like semen quality, and also in women, egg quality or ovulatory regularity. Like, are you ovulating? Is your cycle normal, essentially? So there's a lot of overlap on the basics. Obviously, men need a lot more protein than women. There's also, I'd say, stronger data on certain micronutrients for men than there are for women. Even if that data exists, we have like a lot more studies on men for things like selenium and zinc than we do for women, even though we have some of those. And that's because sperm quality is a lot easier to study than egg quality. With sperm quality, you could very easily get a sample. With egg quality, for the most part, we're looking at like tertiary markers of egg quality. You can't take an egg sample. If you have somebody undergoing IVF or have done some type of fertility treatment where there is egg retrieval, you can have some of those markers. So a lot of the data we do have is from women undergoing assisted reproductive technology. However, it's a lot more limited per what we can study just based on
at this
biology.
point in time. That makes sense. Here's another question too for you, Lily. So I know, you've been mentioning the importance of protein and saturated fat and whatnot in a diet. And, the more I research into the wellness space and nutrition and whatnot, I feel like the less I know, right? And there's constantly like differing opinions and controversial issues, but, one diet is not necessarily the best, like across the board, right? Like what works for one person doesn't work for another person. And I've seen a lot more on like, test for nutritional deficiencies and test to see, what your body might be more inclined to absorb and not absorb. And also to like sensitivity to things like saturated fats and ApoB levels. And all that to say, I guess my question for you is, do you recommend any type of like nutrition testing prior to, adjusting your diet either before or during pregnancy? So for a woman example who might have like a high ApoB level, right, who also recognizes the importance of having, a lot of protein in her diet, I guess my question is, how do you like mitigate like the risk with cardiovascular issues down the road, but also like wanting to prioritize protein for the healthy development of your child? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I mean, I don't have all the answers to this either, I'll say straight up, but there have been some interesting intervention trials looking at ApoB, and it's not across the board that saturated fat in and of itself is going to raise ApoB or even raise cholesterol levels. Some of it has to do with like, you have to look at the entire dietary pattern, because some of these trials have tested out, with protein levels fixed, playing with the fat and carbohydrate ratios. And when you get the carbohydrate levels lower and the fat higher, keeping protein consistent, you actually see better ApoB levels and reduced inflammation and improvement on the whole lipid panel. But again, there's individual variations on things. And so one of the tricky things about any sort of nutrition stuff, and this is why I think it's important to always consider like where you're getting your information. Because if you're working with somebody who's interested in research, but also has a clinical background working with actual humans, you can put to test what you see in studies. And, it's not like we have an intervention trial and 100% of participants have this dramatic improvement. You might have 60% of participants have significant improvement, and overall that is, showing that the intervention was successful. But there's probably some people who had a neutral response and some people who might have even had a negative response. And so I think that's something that clinicians need to take into account. Sometimes you do have people where if their saturated fat intake is too high, you start seeing abnormalities in their lipid panel. And is that truly fine and physiologically normal for them? Or do we need to adjust things? Like there are some people who respond kind of negatively to an excessive amount of saturated fat, and something like a ketogenic diet that's high in saturated fat doesn't work for them. So you can play with the ratios without taking foods that contain saturated fat entirely out of the diet, but maybe we don't need to be having like 6 fat bombs a day made with butter, and you don't need to have butter in your coffee. Like we need to be, thinking a little more ancestrally about how we're approaching nutrition. And maybe that individual does better getting a bit more of their fat from avocados and olives, and what's naturally occurring in their protein foods versus all the added fats coming in. Like, we need to be willing to look at the individual and adjust. But as to the lab question, you can look at a number of labs preconception. Even more so than a lipid panel, I'm interested in blood sugar and insulin levels. Those have a dramatically profound effect on fertility and also pregnancy outcomes. And a lot of times when we bring insulin levels down, we're seeing improvements in their lipid parameters as well. And usually that's going to come down to prioritizing protein, better quality carbohydrates, matching their carb levels to their personal glucose and insulin levels, building in more physical activity so they have more metabolically active tissue like muscle that's going to boost their metabolism. And like in a roundabout way, you naturally improve, the lipid levels. But that would be one thing I would check on. Certainly inflammation levels can be helpful, like with a C-reactive protein. You can check on some nutrient levels. Vitamin D plays a really vital role in fertility. So that's a really key one to check. If you have it available, you could do a full micronutrient panel, but usually you're going outside of the conventional healthcare system for that.
Right.
And a lot of times that's on your own dime. So, it's like you can keep
it's like how much is too much? I guess that's always the question, right?
Like a thyroid panel, that would be really helpful. A lot of times you come up against resistance for checking a full thyroid panel, but without the full panel, it's hard to interpret just TSH and T4. If you get those checked, you might see a red flag and look deeper, but sometimes there's not a red flag on that, but there's significant issues going on with the thyroid, and that plays a role in conception and miscarriage risk. So it gets complex. With fertility, since it really is a reflection of our overall health, you can almost pick and choose virtually any test and make the case for it being helpful. Like people with digestive issues can have fertility issues. Different genetic variations can have fertility issues. And it's like, how far down the rabbit hole do you go?
Right.
That is something that we go into in the lab test chapter of Real Food for Fertility, though, if people want to have a bit more of like a roadmap of what to consider. But, work with your clinician to see whether and what testing you might need.
Right. Would you say that the best place to start, though, is ensuring that you're not insulin resistant and really trying to manage your blood sugar levels across the board?
For the most part, yes. With a caveat that if you fall into the category of somebody who doesn't have a cycle at all, like you have hypothalamic amenorrhea, or you're kind of on that spectrum where your period is really light and short. Maybe you have a short luteal phase. The time between periods is pretty short. Those individuals might not need to have quite as much focus on the blood sugar and insulin. Like in a roundabout way, you will, because a lot of the things we're going to prioritize are going to be similar. But typically the type of pattern that we see in that type of client is they need to be nourished. So that wouldn't be a client where I want to like give them a continuous glucose monitor and have them hyper obsess about any little blip in their blood sugar, because it's just going to further the restrictive behaviors. And a lot of times these individuals actually need to liberalize their diet, maybe even gain some weight and like lay off the gym a little bit, right? So in those individuals, maybe not. Virtually everybody else can benefit from focusing a little more on blood sugar.
No, that makes sense. And this, Lily, could be a whole episode dedicated to itself, but women with PCOS, right? A majority of them have insulin resistance. What is your approach to optimizing fertility in a PCOS patient?
So a lot of the things we've talked about also apply to PCOS, because again, globally, for the most part, we are focusing on optimizing your blood sugar and insulin levels. That said, some particular adjustments for someone with insulin-resistant PCOS, I really highly recommend some blood sugar monitoring to see what spikes your blood sugar and eat in accordance to what your observations are with that testing. Generally speaking, when we're looking at our macronutrients, fat and protein aren't really spiking your blood sugar. Insulin is a separate conversation, but carbohydrates are the macronutrient that really spikes your blood sugar the most.
Yeah.
So you want to be especially considerate of the quantity and also the quality of the carbohydrates you're consuming. Really, get honest with yourself. Like, are there added sugars and ultra processed carbohydrates sneaking in? Is there a lot of refined white flour products? Sometimes we even have people eating like what would be a really good quality diet, but there's like multiple, like there's a slice of sourdough bread with breakfast, there's a sandwich at lunch, and then there's, a large side of potatoes and sweet potatoes at the dinner. And it's just too many carbohydrates for that person's metabolism at this particular period of time. So they really need to lean into more protein, lean into more low starch plant foods. So your non-starchy vegetables, your low sugar fruits. You can play around with the order in which you consume foods to mitigate the blood sugar spikes, like leading with your protein and vegetables at the start of the meal, leaving the carbohydrates for the end of the meal. That could be really helpful. Even playing with meal timing can be helpful. So we have really limited data on intermittent fasting in women, and generally I'm not a huge fan of it. We have a whole section outlining the whys and how to go about it carefully if you want to approach that in Real Food for Fertility. But the small amount of data that we do have that is positive is in women with insulin-resistant PCOS who would benefit from some weight loss. And it's not a calorie-restricted intermittent fasting protocol. It is sufficient calories, no calorie cutting, but simply eating, front-loading your food in the early part of the day, eating a large breakfast, a moderate lunch, a smaller dinner, and then stopping eating earlier in the day so you have a longer fasting window overnight.
Right.
Even if it's just stopping dinner. In the study, they stopped at 4 p.m. They ate all their food from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. But we have other studies that didn't necessarily do an intermittent fast, but just gave a large breakfast, moderate lunch, small dinner versus the opposite, small breakfast, moderate lunch, large dinner. And they saw dramatic improvements in the PCOS symptoms. So don't skip breakfast, have a smaller and earlier dinner can be a really simple and beneficial approach for PCOS.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And for the listener out there, Lily, who has never heard of the term insulin resistance, what markers should they be looking at to determine if they are indeed insulin resistant?
So you can look at both your blood sugar levels, especially your fasting blood sugar levels, give you a lot of information on the likelihood that you're insulin resistant. So as your blood sugar levels get higher, then you can even go down to like 90, but by our current diagnostic standards for prediabetes, the cutoff is 100 milligrams per deciliter. If your fasting blood sugar is higher than that, pretty much guaranteed there's some insulin resistance going on. You can get a fasting insulin level checked. You have to be aware of the lab reference ranges because the cutoff that most labs will give you is 25. But we start seeing insulin resistance issues even above like 9 in some studies, or even in some studies above 5. So if your fasting insulin is running high, that's another red flag. There are different lab markers that they can calculate from blood sugar and insulin that can give you like a level of your insulin resistance, like HOMA-IR is one of them. Some people can see it on a continuous glucose monitor, where you're seeing your blood sugar, have a little sensor in the side of your arm, and you see 24/7 blood sugar patterns. If we're not seeing your blood sugar dip to essentially close to or fasting levels between meals or overnight, like your blood sugar just persistently is like the baseline is a lot higher, because the baseline should really probably be definitely below 90, but sometimes even in the 70s. That would likely be what most people would consider optimal in the research space, although I'm sure that's still up for debate. But if you're seeing your baseline lowest blood sugar is not dropping below 90 at any time point during the day or night, that's a pretty good sign there's some insulin resistance going on. If you see pretty dramatic spikes in blood sugar to a not very large serving of carbohydrates, and then your blood sugar kind of like plateaus and doesn't come down, that's another potential sign of insulin resistance.
Yeah.
But, interpreting CGM takes a lot of clinical skill. And so I just caution people from trying to go at it at their own. I mean, I've been a diabetes educator for a long time, well over 10, 12 years now. And it's a different skill set than even a typical dietitian has, or a typical doctor or nurse. Like, it really is a skill set to interpret CGM readings. And sometimes I feel like people will use CGMs as, they'll interpret like any variation in blood sugar as problematic.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case. It's normal for your blood sugar to do little dips. What we don't want to see is dramatic spikes and crashes, and we don't want to see super prolonged highs without them coming back down.
Right.
So somebody who's like blood sugar goes up to 140 or 150, and then it's hanging out there for many hours before coming down, it's a pretty clear sign of insulin resistance. But I don't want somebody who has an apple and goes to 120 and then comes back down within an hour to like freak out that something's wrong. That's a normal blood sugar response.
Yeah. That was me last year. I experimented with CGMs just for the fun of it. And that's initially what I thought. If I saw a spike that was 30 or 40 points, I'd freak out. But then realizing that, obviously if you have something with natural sugar in it, that's what's going to happen. So interpretation is definitely key there.
Yeah. Definitely.
And in terms of non-dietary interventions, Lily, like supplement-wise for managing blood sugar, I mean, there's a lot of research on like berberine or inositol. Are you a fan of either of those for, again, specifically women with PCOS in terms of trying to manage those levels?
I'm a bigger fan of inositol than berberine. If you use berberine, you'd have to stop ideally before you even try to conceive, but certainly at the time of your first pregnancy test, because it is not safe in pregnancy. So that is one that's a little bit tricky with the fertility equation. Like, when in your plans for actually trying to get pregnant are you taking it? If it's a while out, it's probably fine, but right in that interim, it becomes a little bit tricky. Whereas inositol is it's a nutrient. It's a B vitamin-like compound. It has literally 0 studies showing any sort of teratogenicity, which means your risk of birth defects. And in fact, there's many trials that use it during pregnancy for the prevention of gestational diabetes or the management of gestational diabetes. So it's one that you can continue taking through the whole pregnancy. And we have head-to-head trials on inositol supplementation compared to another really common intervention in PCOS, which is the medication metformin. And a lot of times inositol performs similarly. Sometimes it performs better than metformin in those trials. So it's a really useful one. Most of the studies are using about 4 grams per day. That's 4,000 milligrams, usually in split dosages. I use it very commonly in gestational diabetes as well. For some women, it's that little added kick that helps them avoid insulin or medication with their blood sugar management. So I'm a huge fan of inositol. That depending on how PCOS is presenting, there can be a number of other supplements that could also be beneficial. But many times if you're taking a comprehensive prenatal vitamin, many of your micronutrient levels are met already. But inositol is usually not one that's going to be included in sufficient quantities to give you a therapeutic dose for PCOS.
Right. That makes sense. On the topic of prenatal vitamins, what should women be looking for when they're looking for a prenatal vitamin? And I don't know if you could recommend a brand or, something like one that you like in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. It's super complicated these days. It feels like every other week there's a new prenatal coming out on the market. It's kind of hard to keep up with, honestly. I mean, I'm always following it and everybody's always asking me. So I'm always looking at the new formulas. But yeah, a number of things to keep in mind. So you want to look for one that is comprehensive, like covers your bases on a wide array of micronutrients. There are some that just sort of cherry pick a handful of nutrients that they think are important and then leave out the rest. So it's like, okay, maybe some of the things in the formula look okay, but you've left out choline, or you've left out iodine, or you've left out zinc. And like, why did you pick and choose those ones? So look for ones that have an array. When you're looking at all the micronutrients, it's at least like 23 different nutrients.
Yeah.
You want to look at the nutrient forms to make sure they're bioavailable. So you might be looking at the types of folate in them, the types of vitamin A. Super common problem with a lot of prenatals is they don't include any preformed vitamin A. They only include beta carotene. And while we have to be careful about the amount of preformed vitamin A, you do need some. At least half of people don't have the genetics to convert beta carotene into vitamin A in their body, and this becomes a problem. I've written about this at length in my books and on my blog if you want to look into this. Whether the formula by default includes iron is a red flag for me. Not everybody needs iron supplementation, and if you put iron in it, you're going to compromise your absorption of the calcium that also might be in there. Hopefully it has calcium. A lot of them leave it out because it's a bulky nutrient, takes up a lot of space. I'm also looking for choline. Does it have some choline in like a decent concentration? That's another both expensive and bulky nutrient, which takes up capsule space. So if you're looking at something like a prenatal that only has a couple of capsules a day as the dosage, is not going to be very good potency, simply because you need the capsule space to fit those bulky nutrients. So those are a handful of things. I could keep going. Quality control is huge, and so many supplement companies completely skip that.
Yeah.
And a lot of the brands, and I'm not naming names, who have a lot of money, investor money usually, going into affiliate marketing are some of the worst, honestly. So I'll just leave it at that. There's two brands I really like. Fullwell and Seeking Health are both really good quality. They're practitioner-founded supplement companies, so they didn't pay to get somebody's name and likeness on their website. They're actually formulated by a clinician, and this I find brings up a much different ethical standard to the company than somebody founded by a business person or investors, where they're just looking to try to turn a profit. Because guess what? Hitting all the marks on a number of different things I've just mentioned is very expensive. Having a company that tests every single batch for quantity, consistency, purity is very expensive, and that's not what most companies do. And so those are the two that I have full trust that do all the things right. And they also have, other supplements available to fill in the gaps. So both of them leave out iron, but you can take an extra iron supplement if your labs indicate. Both of them leave out omega-3s. This is intentional. You don't want omega-3s packaged with your iron and B vitamins. It's going to oxidize your omega-3s and make them essentially inflammatory to your system instead of providing benefit. So that's built into the formulas intentionally, and you can add those things on the side. But I have really good results clinically with them. I get feedback from thousands of people on supplements, consistently positive feedback on them. So those would be the ones I'd consider.
All right, good to know. I was making a note of those as you were discussing them. Another question too for you, Lily. So I've read that women with the MTHFR gene mutation, which is actually a lot more than we otherwise think it is, should not be supplementing with synthetic folic acid, and instead opt for methylated forms of folate, and that perhaps even taking a prenatal might be detrimental in that situation. What are your thoughts on that?
The MTHFR conversation is pretty complicated, so I'll say that to start. And I've tried to address this in a number of different ways to make it as clear to people as possible. I have a whole article on my website on folate versus folic acid. I talk about MTHFR there. I have a 2-hour webinar on it with the Women's Health Nutrition Academy.
There's a whole section.
There's a whole section on MTHFR and fertility in Real Food for Fertility as well, chapter 13, if you specifically want to dive into the fertility research. So the issue in a nutshell, and I'll try to keep this brief, it's hard to, is folate is an umbrella term. And there's many different things that fall under the umbrella of folate. You have the folate that naturally occurs in food. There's over 150 different forms that naturally occur in the world, in nature, in plants and animals. You have the supplemental forms of folate. Some of them would be forms that are more easily metabolized, like you mentioned, methylated folate. There's others. And then you have folic acid. And folic acid doesn't occur in nature at all. This is a man-made version of folate. Folate comes in so many different forms because the molecule is complex and it can have all these different things attached to like the core structure that is, you could call it the folic acid, but the folic acid is synthetic. You never find it like that in nature. It's an oxidized form of folate. And while it's really easy for your body to absorb from your intestines, and it's a very stable molecule that can be fortified into refined grains and then made into bread and baked in an oven, and the folic acid still like is stable enough to exist and be a sort of nutrient for your body. Even though it's absorbed well, your body doesn't utilize it well, because it turns out that it's not metabolically active until it has been methylated. So your body has to go through several different steps to convert folic acid into methylfolate before it can function in your body the way that we need folate to function to do all these very important metabolic processes. Now, this is why 95 to 98% of the folate in your body, in your bloodstream, in your red blood cells, even in umbilical cord blood, so fetal blood supply, is in the form of methylfolate. Okay, because that's what your body needs. Some people, the enzyme that is needed to methylate folate is called MTHFR. And about half of us have some type of genetic variation in how this enzyme functions. Doesn't mean that you can't use folic acid at all, but you have a reduced ability to methylate it and therefore make folic acid be of benefit to your body. And depending on which type of MTHFR variation you have, and this is where it gets all complex, and I go through all those different versions in Real Food for Fertility and also that webinar. Some people have like a 70% reduced ability to methylate it. And so then you have a buildup of what's called unmethylated folic acid, UMFA, you can look it up in the medical literature, circulating in your body. And that can actually block some of your other folate enzymes, folate-dependent enzymes, where now you have a functional deficiency in folate, but you have high levels of unmetabolized folic acid. Because again, it isn't a biologically useful compound until it's been methylated.
Right.
So given that not everybody is tested for MTHFR, right? I think it's important to point out that everybody can metabolize methylfolate. And there's another version of folate that's really easy for your body to metabolize that's called folinic acid, not folic, folinic acid. You'll see it in supplements under the name calcium folinate. They just bind the folinic acid to calcium. That one also is very easy to metabolize, even if you have an MTHFR variation. So anybody can metabolize them as well, even if you don't have one of these things. So from a standpoint of like being proactive about this and making sure your folate status is good going into pregnancy and throughout pregnancy, I think it is wise to simply optimize your intake of folate from folate-rich foods. There's a whole list of those with concentrations in that folate blog I just mentioned. And then also to supplement with a form of folate that everybody's metabolism can handle regardless of any genetic variations. So methylfolate or folinic acid will do that. People who are just an average American is already taking in pretty much as much folic acid as they can metabolize from refined grains. Like we can only metabolize about 300 or so micrograms per day. And that's already what most people are eating from refined grains. Of course, if your diet doesn't have any refined grains, maybe that's, not even a consideration for you. But I think a lot of people are just taking a lot. And it's very, very common among reproductive endocrinologists to put people on really high dose folic acid. Yeah. And there's been some interesting studies where they've looked at individuals who are put on high dose folic acid. It's usually like a 5,000 microgram per day dosage. And note that the tolerable upper limit defined by the Institute of Medicine is 1,000 micrograms. Okay. So you put them on 5,000 micrograms and you start seeing more metabolic issues. You see a rise in their homocysteine levels. You see a rise in unmetabolized folic acid. You see delays in conception, and then you switch them over to methylfolate, even at a much lower dose, like 500 micrograms. And then suddenly their homocysteine levels come down, their red blood cell folate levels normalize, and they're able to get pregnant. So we just need to like take a step back from all the noise about folic acid in this world and just look at the biochemistry. Like, it's really straightforward, and it's kind of wild how this has become so controversial.
Yeah. Wow. That was incredibly helpful. That like 5-minute synopsis, Lily, was like more helpful than the hour conversations I've heard on MTHFR, because there is so much noise. And again, it's just a matter of, sifting through the noise. One other question too for you on supplements. I know we're nearing our time. I could talk to you for hours, Lily, but aside from a prenatal, are there any other supplements that you suggest women include in their diet pre-conception and also during pregnancy?
Okay. And preconception, there can be some differences. Just as like a overarching theme, you have like so much more wiggle room outside of pregnancy to be experimental with things. And then during pregnancy, we are kind of limited by what we have the research on. So I'll just say that, like, you want to be a little more careful during pregnancy itself. But some that definitely overlap between both preconception and pregnancy would be a comprehensive prenatal that we've already talked about. Usually, like the 2 formulas I mentioned have enough vitamin D for most individuals, but if your lab tests show that you're still deficient, you might need some extra vitamin D and possibly also some extra magnesium, which helps with vitamin D metabolism. Magnesium, for many other reasons, is also very helpful and is on my list. Some women need extra iodine, so that's a possibility. A fish oil supplement, if you are someone who's not eating at least 12 to 16 ounces of high omega-3 seafood per week, which my experience is outside of individuals who are living in like Alaska, where they're fishing all the time and eating a whole bunch of wild-caught salmon, most individuals are really not consuming that level of seafood. The average US woman is eating only about 3 ounces per week. So a fish oil supplement or an algae-based DHA supplement, if you're not consuming sea animals, would be really helpful. Then you start to get into a bunch of extras, right? So like probiotics and different formulas of probiotics could be considered either preconception or in pregnancy, for example. You have somebody who's tested for iron deficiency anemia. You know it's an iron issue. You can supplement with extra iron. I do also highly recommend prioritizing your food sources of iron, especially the ones that are really easily absorbed. I have a whole article on my site on that if you want to look that up. Sometimes if you have an individual who's not consuming dairy products, it does indeed get tricky to hit your calcium needs. And so a calcium supplement could be an option. Again, it's kind of up to like taking into account the full clinical picture here. I don't really love putting people on calcium unless it's truly necessary, but there is a time and a place for that. And then in the fertility realm, there's like a whole array of supplements that can be possibly utilized. We talked about inositol for PCOS, even just general fertility. It can be beneficial. You don't have to have a known blood sugar or insulin issue. It's something that I personally take, even though my blood sugar and insulin levels are good. There's a number of different antioxidant type compounds that can be really helpful. Alpha lipoic acid, CoQ10, or a handful of those. There's some amino acids that can be really helpful, like L-carnitine is a really helpful one, especially in PCOS. There's even some data on hypothalamic amenorrhea. I didn't mention collagen, but collagen I find is also really helpful because a lot of people are not consuming collagen-rich foods in the way in which we did ancestrally. So that's another one that can be of benefit. It's probably the shortest list I can give you.
No, that's pretty comprehensive still. One other thing that came to mind when you mentioned calcium, and I know this is dependent upon the individual and the clinical picture, but a lot of people or a lot of the research or whatnot, the noise out there has said that women with PCOS should avoid inflammatory foods. And within that group of inflammatory foods, I've seen dairy grouped as well as gluten. And I know dairy, this is a whole other complex issue, the difference between A1 and A2, casein protein and what's inflammatory and what's not. But are there any foods that you are like a strong believer that should not be omitted from someone's diet during pregnancy?
That should not be omitted.
Yes.
Dairy is a tricky one because people have such individual responses to it. In all of my books, I am pro dairy, like pro high quality dairy. And, the level of detail I get into high quality dairy like differs depending on the book. Real Food for Fertility, we go into the most detail on it. We talk about A1 and A2. We talk about raw milk and unhomogenized and all the different various options and goat and sheep's milk and whatever. As a whole, I tend to see benefit with including dairy in the diet. It can leave a lot of nutritional holes. Calcium is just one of them, but it can leave holes in your riboflavin intake, vitamin B2, your B12, if you're not eating a lot of animal foods, your iodine, especially if you're not eating a lot of seafood. There's just a whole number of your vitamin K2, vitamin D. There's a lot of things that we want to consider with dairy where if it's possible to include some type of dairy, even if it's sheep or goat's milk dairy, and even if it's like only a low lactose version, like a yogurt or a goat cheese or something, it still tends to fill a lot of nutritional gaps. So I try to keep it in the diet if we can. There are, of course, times where that's not the case. There's an overt allergy or symptoms are such that it doesn't work out. Mm-hmm. But I think most often the adverse outcomes people have from including dairy are from conventional dairy, like not super great quality dairy that's pasteurized. So, take with it what you will. I do, at the end of the day, animal foods do provide a lot of different nutrients that are highly beneficial, both for fertility and hormone balance, and also for pregnancy outcomes, fetal development. So I am a proponent of an omnivorous diet with as much variety as you can get. So there's, again, always going to be people where for whatever reason they don't want to include those things, and there's a lot of nutritional gaps you need to consider. But generally speaking, if you can consume animal foods from an array of sources, and also plant proteins as well, like beans and legumes have their own benefits. That's where I think you're most likely, and not where I think, where I know you're most likely to hit your micronutrient needs. Because one of my little side projects is running sample meal plans through micronutrient analyses and see where the holes are. Like, I don't know why more people don't do this, but you notice when you do that, okay, we came up with a pescatarian meal plan. So fish and seafood also includes dairy and eggs, but no red meat, no chicken or whatever. And unless you're including bivalve shellfish like oysters, clams, and mussels virtually every day, you see pretty significant nutritional gaps. And like seafood every day, right? And most pescatarians are vegetarian and they eat seafood once or twice a week, right? Then you have more nutritional gaps that you need to consider. So if people are including some red meat, including the organs every once in a while, including meat on the bone, like roast a whole chicken and then make use of the bones for making bone broth, right? You're getting a much better mix of nutrients than if your food choices are much more limited. I do also think it's highly beneficial for people to include some plant foods as well. So a lot of people take my words and then they're like, oh, she's pro carnivore. You can be pro an animal forward diet or a diet that includes some animal protein as part of the overall protein intake and still be like, there's benefits to eating vegetables and fruit and legumes and many times whole grains, right? We have again, exceptions to that with some individuals, but the more variety as a whole, the better. Like it is what it is. And I've experimented with my range of different restrictive diets over the years out of curiosity. And it also comes down to what's sustainable too. And to me, the most sustainable is one that has the most variety for what your individual physiology can tolerate. And it's also the one that hits the micronutrient marks.
Yeah, that makes sense. For your 2 pregnancies, Lily, did you experiment in terms of different eating patterns, or were you pretty consistent across both of them?
I ate pretty similar to how I describe in my books. With that said, of course, first trimester has its ups and downs with food intake. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't say, as is probably the case for like 90% of pregnant women, that I was eating super optimally in that stage where I was kind of queasy and just like, I don't want to eat that. I don't want to, cook. Somebody cook for me.
Yep.
The food in front of me already made.
Yeah. My sister is like that.
Yeah, that's super, super common. So that stage, probably not as much. And then just, regionally where you live at the time, that certainly can influence how you eat. So with my first pregnancy, I was living in Alaska. I ate a lot of seafood because that was what was available.
Right.
And inexpensive. You basically get when you're a resident, you get your fishing license for like $25 a year, and then
that's amazing.
Fish your limit, and everybody's trying to give away the excess salmon that they've fished, right? So a lot more seafood up there, and of course, my son is like super smart, and he loves fish. So it's kind of funny, but for the most part, I ate pretty similarly. I mean, you could scroll back. I didn't have Instagram when I was pregnant with my son, but you could scroll back through my super old Instagram, see plenty of examples of what I was eating. It's pretty consistent with what I'm describing here. And, a lot of overlap too with postpartum and fertility nutrition, like the specific amounts vary and the portion sizes might vary, and the rationale for eating certain foods certainly does vary. Yep. But I did a lot of the experimenting when I was much younger. So, tried raw vegan and
Really?
Oh yeah. I lasted about a week, and I was like, even living in Southern California, this is like completely, this is a mismatch and so difficult. And I feel terrible that this doesn't make any sense. So I did a lot of experimenting without getting like dogmatic or overly restrictive about it, just from like a curiosity standpoint.
Right.
And that of course informs, when you watch the different dietary fads come and go, like
exactly.
I can be a proponent of moderately low carb, but I've tried out keto many times, and my body really truly does run better when I have some carbs, and I don't have a metabolic need to be keto. So I'm not going to eat keto, but I can still be conscious of the different foods that overly spike my blood sugar compared to other foods with a similar carbohydrate amount, and notice that and make adjustments without being so dogmatic that like everybody needs to eat less than 20 grams of carbs a day. It's like, I've tried that. It really doesn't work well for me, and that's fine,
Yeah. No, I hear you. I also like to experiment on myself too. My sister's husband has actually been on the carnivore diet for the past, I don't know, well over 5 or 6 years now. And he thrives on it. And that's
some people do great on it.
So that's why, again, I feel like when someone, tends to find a diet that works for them and they go out and say, everyone should do this, I'm like, no, everyone is different.
And pregnancy also is an interesting, it's humbling, right? Because you might go into it with this expectation that you're going to eat a certain way. I see it a lot with the people who are keto or carnivore, that they're going to continue on that during pregnancy. And then your body just won't allow it sometimes. I mean, not saying I've never seen it. I certainly have seen people do it, but especially the first trimester, there's often some bumps in the road, and maybe there's some reasons that your body wants more carbohydrates. Like your thyroid is ramping up hormone production like crazy, and maybe you need some carbs right now. Maybe that craving for citrus is because you need the extra potassium or folate or vitamin C. Like I'm a strong proponent of sort of leaning into those signals instead of trying to like just stick to your guns and muscle through it. I think there's some wisdom there sometimes with the cravings.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Emily, Lily, I do want to be conscious of your time. It is 11:04, and again, I could talk to you for another few hours, but this has been such an insightful conversation. I'm so excited to share it with listeners. But with that, where can they pick up a copy of your awesome books? And you mentioned your Instagram. If you could share that handle with us as well.
Yeah, for sure. So go over to my website, lilynicholsrdn.com, and then click on the books tab. And just scroll down. Shows you all the different ways and formats where you can purchase the book. It has actually come to my attention as of yesterday that there's like counterfeit sellers on eBay. Really highly recommend not trying to buy books on eBay. Okay. Don't buy books on eBay. For what it's worth, Amazon is often the best place to buy as long as it says ships and sold from Amazon. I do also carry many of my ebooks over on shop.lilynicholsrdn.com. And I do also carry the paperback for Real Food for Pregnancy there as well. But for the rest of them, paperback, your best option is Amazon. Go through the link that I link out. So it's not a fake. There's tons of fake wannabe versions, as well as the counterfeit versions on eBay, apparently. I know it's like whack-a-mole with these criminals. So it is what it is. As for my site, also, there's lots of freebies there. So if you want to like read the first chapter of Real Food for Pregnancy, you can read that there and click on the freebies tab for more. There's hundreds of articles on my blog. We mentioned a bunch today. So use the search bar for whatever key term and you'll easily pull up the articles. As for social media land, I'm most active on Instagram. My handle is @LilyNicholsRDN. I post a lot of research there. Just like, I don't know, random pictures of my food. I feel like my Instagram is, I don't run my Instagram like a typical Instagram account where there's like a million reels or anything. Yeah. So take it or leave it. It's kind of old school Instagram with images and research, but it is what it is.
I think that's the best kind. So kudos to you. That's awesome. Well, Lily, my last question for you, and this is always my favorite one to ask, and that is, what does being well and strong mean to you?
Oh, being well and strong, having the energy to go through the day and not burn out, which is easier said than done when you're a mom and, in entrepreneur land. But take care of yourself so that you feel good.
Yeah. With a 5 and 9-year-old, you said?
Yeah. Yep.
I'm sure. Well, Lily, this has been such a fun conversation. I'm so excited to share it with listeners, and I hope to have you on again at some point soon.
Yeah, thank you.